As a quick note, it was February 26th when I had finished writing this, and then obviously it's currently April 1st when I'm recording this. I probably worked on the written portion of it for probably a month or two before actually finishing drafting it on February 26th. And then obviously since then, things like Ukraine have been invaded and all that. So yeah, this video will not really touch on that too much. It's still just a thought experiment / entertainment kind of thing. But things that you could possibly get out of that is if you're anywhere with disrupted internet or services or anything like that, and you want to communicate with friends and family, you can always check out Briar, which allows you to communicate without a centralized server and go through Bluetooth, LAN, and the internet. Secondly, wireless radios allow communication completely outside of what you'd think of as modern technology, such as phones and stuff. And some can be paired with phones and for text-based communication, and some tools like the GoTenna Mesh allow mesh networks. That said though, that's about all the practical information you're actually going to get from here, and the rest of this is all still just pretty much entertainment type of stuff. Anyway though, back to the actual content. Okay, so back to the original content. Anyway, I've been watching The Walking Dead a little bit lately, and even though I'm probably a bit behind on the trend as I only started watching it like 6 months ago, I'm almost caught up here, and anyways, I thought I might try out a little thought experiment. What if you wanted to create your own internet within the apocalypse? If so, what are your options, and what can you do with it if you build it? Believe it or not, you could actually possibly host a live stream on the internet made from scratch in such a scenario, and though it won't work in most of the options laid out, and there would actually be legitimate uses to such a so-called internet. Before I begin, I would just like to point out that this is mostly a thought experiment. Networking is a good chunk of my job, but at the end of the day, I haven't done things such as set up a GMRS mesh network, which I'll explain in a bit, so no guarantees that this stuff would actually work, especially exactly as I lay them out. Regardless, time to get started in somewhat of a disorganized fashion. Ultimately, the internet is simply built on connections between computers. If I load a file on my phone's browser using HTTP from a server via cellular data on my phone using radio waves to communicate with the cell tower to request the information is then sent from the cell tower to the cell company servers, probably through a high-speed cable, where it's then processed, and if it was a domain that was requested, DNS is used to look up which IP is associated with the domain, and then with the IP looked up, or with DNS completely skipped, if the IP was requested instead of a domain, the connection is made. Say it's a server in a building that has internet provided by a cable company. In that case, it goes from the cell company servers to the cable internet provider, then from the cable internet provider to the server in the building, and then everything's just completely reversed, and the file is sent back in packets, which are just pieces of the file, which are then received and assembled into the file by my phone's browser. You may be familiar with my writings on IPFS, in which I spoke about the differences between IPFS and HTTP. In this case, however, they're both connections between devices running on IPv4 or 6, and the above example works out the same way regardless. Long story short, as long as your electronics have the capability of communicating, and that they've been configured to do so, then they should work perfectly fine. And even though the modern global internet has a lot of complexity, if you're scaling it down like in this thought experiment, it is actually legitimately buildable. So I'll start out by explaining some of the important quote-unquote layers that build up such a fictional network. I apologize if I give too many random aspects quickly, but once I get past explaining all the individual parts, I'll give some examples of them being used, so even if I do a really bad job explaining all the parts individually, they'll definitely start to make sense once they're all actually put together. Power. So, on to the plans. To start out, if you want to build a network like this, then you obviously need power. In The Walking Dead, they seem to run into Schrodinger's power reserves, in which there's simultaneously unlimited power and no power, and we'll never know for sure which is at play until the writers decide if it'll make a good plot point. That said, there's a few ways you could possibly get power even if the grid is down. What you intend to build with the network, as well as what supplies you actually have at hand, definitely dictate your options, and right off the bat, we can probably rule out anything like geothermal, hydro, coal, nuclear, most windmills, and just about anything else that would require serious service by serious experts, and also serious amounts of parts to keep them going. That brings us mostly to generators, solar panels, and manual power. generators initially would be the simplest option, and as long as there's fuel, then you can get the exact amount of power that is required. There are a few caveats here, however, as obviously you need fuel. Cheap home generators can run on gasoline or propane, and there are diesel generators out there as well, but obviously there's a limited supply of fuel. Gasoline goes bad, and though fuel stabilizers are cheap, unless you're growing crops for fuel ethanol or oil for a diesel generator, you can't really get more fuel once it's gone. And good luck making propane. Beyond that, even if you were using ethanol or plant-based oil for gasoline or diesel generators respectively, it's my understanding that if you're using solely ethanol or plant-based oil, those wear out pretty fast. And furthermore, a lot of generators, at least the kind of stuff you'd pick up at the hardware store, won't actually be safe to run with electronics out of the box, so you'd have to take that into account as well. Your next option, which seems obvious, is solar panels. They come in all shapes and sizes, from huge ones with high outputs to ones small enough to fit in a backpack, and are good for all sorts of people who want or need power outside of the electrical grid. The problem comes obviously when you want power and the sun's not out, and while solar panels are probably the best option here, depending on your setup, you may need some very beefy solar panel systems. And last, in terms of power, there are actually some ways for you to generate power manually. This usually comes with things like a wind-up radio that'll charge via USB, or chargers that will generate power while you're riding your bike or something like that. And obviously they won't generate enough power for most things, but you could probably charge a mobile device or a radio or a flashlight or something like that, so I guess it's worth mentioning. Now, storing power. Once you have enough power, you'll obviously be limitations that you have to contend with, and first and most obvious, power will pretty much have to be used where you generate it. You can run devices or charge batteries, but otherwise you're limited to how far you can run an electrical cord from your source of power, and once your power generation quits, devices quit unless they can store power themselves. Storing or transporting power. Once you have power though, there will be a couple limitations you have to contend with. First, power will pretty much have to be used where you generate it. You can run devices or charge batteries where you're generating the power, but otherwise you're limited to about as far as you can run an extension cord from your power source. And secondly, there's another thing you'll run into, and that's obviously you only have power if you're generating it. If you're using something like solar, then once the sun goes down, you're limited solely to what you have in storage. Batteries like car batteries are not meant to have a constant pull on them, and they'll probably fail pretty quick if you try and run a bunch of devices off them day in and day out. And there are things like deep cycle lead acid batteries that are intended for boat engines, and those might actually store power decently, and if you were able to get your hands on one, a number of lithium ion batteries would probably be perfect. And there are also battery systems, which often are known as solar generators, that come pre-built for power storage. Additionally, many devices from phones and laptops to portable radios also have built-in rechargeable batteries, and while only some of them are power efficient enough to be charged via a USB power bank, so depending on the scale of what you want to build, they might be your best bet for reliability since they can store their own power themselves. Infrastructure. Okay, so you have power, and now you need to be able to have your devices communicate. How ambitious you are depends on what kind of lines, metaphorical or literal, that you want to lay out. Just keep in mind, however, that some kind of devices may be incompatible with some of these options. So, cables. Speaking of metaphorical and quite literal lines, your first option is to literally lay out a cable. Stepping outside and burying 500 feet worth of weatherproof Ethernet cable is actually far from impossible, and cables are a pretty efficient means of getting data from one place to another in a reliable, high-speed fashion. But obviously, unless you've got the equipment and manpower to lay cables on a massive scale, then there's a limit to the distance in which you can use them. Wi-Fi and LANs. I'll use Wi-Fi and LAN interchangeably here. The home Wi-Fi network is pretty standard now, and even when it's not connected to the modern internet, it's still very functional as a LAN, and if you're building a makeshift mini-internet, then you can provide access to that as well. Furthermore, you can always get the benefit of most modern devices being able to connect to it without a hassle. Many modern devices can create their own Wi-Fi or LAN network, and something like a router or laptop can create a network that can also bridge a connection from something like a wired Ethernet connection to a mobile device by creating a Wi-Fi network. You can also buy routers capable of projecting Wi-Fi 5 to 10,000 square feet with extenders that can increase that range indefinitely, so you can provide a pretty big area with connectivity through Wi-Fis and LANs. They also have the benefit of being able to get data to a large number of devices easily, and sure, cables are a really efficient means of getting high-speed and low-maintenance connections between a couple of important devices, but if you start building out a huge network, then with too many cables, you run into issues where you might need to start including switches and such, which require power themselves, and a bunch of complex configuration issues. So even if you rely on cables for building a backbone of such a hypothetical network, in the apocalypse, it's still best to be left using wireless communications at the edges of the network if you plan on having plenty of people connect to the network to utilize it with their own devices. So next, there's long-range radio. Beyond Wi-Fi, which uses radio signals at fairly short ranges, you can actually get data transferred pretty far using radio waves. Keep in mind that cell phones are pretty much a handheld radio with a computer built in, and satellites are radios with big reflective dishes to send and receive data in a precise manner. One option for a long-distance radio setup is to use something that operates similar to a proxy ham style device. If you're unaware, a proxy ham device was originally developed to access Wi-Fi at long ranges, supposedly up to 9 miles under ideal conditions, and while the proxy ham never actually got released to the public, it's possible to build a makeshift device with a USB Wi-Fi receiver, a flexible USB cable, and a satellite dish or even a metal colander. Next, there's the ability to use analog radio systems to send data. Products like the GoTenna Mesh allow you to create a mesh network using GMRS band radio signals, allowing you to share data or communications. Similarly, some ham radio operators use APRS, which allows sending and receiving of packets via the radio signals. There are also FRS and GMRS radios, which allow you to pair them with the phone and send and receive what amount to text between users over reasonable distances. Quick disclaimer here, obviously in real life, there are certain limitations to what you're allowed to send, how you do it, and what licenses you need when it comes to radio networks. Though I guess if this is a thought experiment about a hypothetical zombie apocalypse, then you can do pretty much whatever you want, but just thought I'd throw a disclaimer out there. Last, there's manual transmission. Despite all these complicated options, it's still possible to deal with distance by simply walking or verbally transmitting data with a radio. Obviously, there's a limit to what you can verbally transmit over the radio, but it doesn't require much in terms of setup, and you can also simply bring a device from one place to another and connect it to an FTP server or transmit a prior message that you received. More on that in the software section, or just simply bring a thumb drive or SD card or hard drive from one place to another. Hardware. Once you have power and a means for devices to communicate, the next logical step to address is the devices themselves that make up the hypothetical network. We have a lot of options, and of course a wide variety of devices can connect to one another and work in tandem, but I'm mainly going to divide this into 3 groups of devices: servers, desktops, and laptops. Okay, you might be wondering why I just lumped budget laptops and state-of-the-art servers in the mix, but when it comes down to software and what they're capable of running, it's not really their specs. Running a full-blown computer of some form will allow much greater processing power, and also allow more advanced things such as configuring a DNS setup to use real domains in this hypothetical makeshift setup. If you are going to store a lot of data, run anything complex, or have a very complex network itself with a lot of connectivity, then a full-blown computer of some sort would definitely be the way to go. Breaking things down a little bit more, dedicated servers and many powerful desktops have much more power than laptops and lower-end devices, and if you were going to run anything, say like a video streaming service, or wanted to have a huge complex library of data, or had just a huge network and needed a powerful device to facilitate that network, then you would definitely want a much more powerful device. This comes at the cost, however, of requiring increased power and possible increased complexity. Not to mention that you also have to find and prepare such a device. Laptops, on the other hand, require much less power and usually also have a battery built into them. They have the bonus of usually being able to create a Wi-Fi network themselves and utilize Bluetooth and such, while also having the ability to run software like Windows servers and Linux distros, and also have ports like USB and Ethernet. While they lack in computing power compared to a much more powerful device, if you're building a network like this, you may or may not actually need a ton of computing power, so something like a cheap laptop would probably suffice in many circumstances. They're real common, and you can bypass the password super easily on an unencrypted device, and even if the hard drive is encrypted, you can still just wipe the laptop and use it itself. Last, there's mobile devices and micro devices. Since this is a theoretical network for the apocalypse, however, you can still go a lot smaller than laptops, and the first of that is just phones. Phones are pretty much mini computers these days, and you can easily run an FTP server, create a LAN network, and host plenty of other low power processes. They are also really power efficient, and you would probably be able to pretty much run a mini network from a $20 solar charger and a phone. Now, of course, they're unable to accept most wired communications or physical storage, however, and they lack the ability to run certain software, so don't expect to run a DNS server on a phone. But phones and tablets also make a great endpoint. For example, say you had a Raspberry Pi receiving packets from a radio, and then connecting to a LAN created by a phone, and then anybody who wanted to connect a device to that network so they could be patched into a larger network using the radio could just connect to the LAN created by the phone and use that as a means of actually getting into the network. Beyond that, a phone could just simply create a LAN and be located in one main building, and anytime someone wanted to share a file or leave a digital message, they could just go into that building and connect to the network. Last, Android would probably be apt simply because it's easy to sideload on Android, and if the Apple Store goes down, then you're stuck with whatever you've already installed. That said, it's not like Apple would be useless, since you could still try and jailbreak it, or simply use it for the installed software. And last, I thought I would mention micro devices such as a Raspberry Pi. With a device like this, it's probably less powerful than a mobile device, but it's also more so geared to networking and that sort of stuff. So it's probably almost equal in ability to perform small tasks as a phone. A Raspberry Pi could be connected to a network through LAN or wired connection and host a whole bunch of lightweight content or perform tasks such as interpret radio transmissions and allow devices to communicate a long range. Finally, not quite part of the network itself, but I thought I'd touch on end-user devices. And an end-user device is simply any device that a user themselves connects to the internet to use for their personal use. You could have a person connect to a LAN network with a phone or something like that to send messages or receive files, and these devices usually wouldn't be online 24/7 and wouldn't disrupt anything if they go offline. So these devices don't matter too much, and especially if it's the owner's responsibility to keep them charged and running. But overall, something like a cell phone, because like I mentioned, they have a built-in battery and don't require too much power, would probably be perfect for something like this. Software. Okay, so power, connections, and hardware make a network possible, but it's software that gives functionality to it. Now, given this is a hypothetical thought experiment, I could just say you need to program everything from scratch, but in reality, getting modern existing software is the way to go here. Obviously, lots of modern software like Google Chat would be useless if Google is down, and protocols like IPFS, while great, given their hash identification system and the fact that this hypothetical network would probably be too small and inconsistent, decentralized tools like that wouldn't work very well either. Instead, there's specific tools, however, that'll fit these roles nicely, and many of them you might have expected to find in a home network a decade back. Also, because it's a thought experiment that takes place in the apocalypse, security is less of a concern since there's not too much to worry about outdated or somewhat insecure systems. First, you need operating systems and general tools like that. Windows and Linux installs would certainly be good. A portable Linux distro like Puppy Linux would be ideal for bypassing passwords on computers you'd come across. Software to provide things like DNS, or software that allows packets to be sent over ham or GMRS radio are also things that would be crucial. And additionally, you'd need, generic utility software. Obviously, if it needs to check for a subscription, then the software is useless, since even though you could change where the domain points through DNS configuration, you'd still have to spoof a certificate to sign things like Microsoft Office or Adobe software, so that all that's out of the question. Instead, just generic document editors, photo editors, note-taking apps, calculators, calendars, file compressors, ebook readers, music and video players, audio recorders, HTML document editors, and plenty more would be useful to have in forms for multiple operating systems, for computers and mobile. And also, in the apocalypse, GPS would probably be useless in a couple of weeks. However, offline GPS would still be useful for mapping tools, and things like Ozoman would still be useful for understanding trains and making map markers, even if GPS itself can no longer determine a location. Next, communication tools would be extremely important. Most messengers are useless without a central host, Apple Messenger, Google Chat, Signal, Telegram, WhatsApp, etc. But there are still a number of options. Email could possibly be configured via DNS, but the email itself would probably be a little bit clunky to configure and unnecessary for a network like this. Federated messengers like Matrix or XAMPP would be a bit simpler to use. And there are also messengers like FireChat, which work off Bluetooth only, though I haven't personally used FireChat, and federated messengers would still be a bit finicky. That said, in my opinion, Briar should be the go-to of any apocalyptic network engineer, and Briar operates in a mesh network style, providing all the data one device has to another device whenever they can reach each other, meaning it would work perfectly in a situation where devices cannot always reliably communicate with each other, and it also is completely decentralized, not relying on any centralization or federation, which means that it can communicate through the internet, Bluetooth, or LAN network, and can host group chats, private chats, and discussion boards. Next, you definitely need a way to share files. This could be photos, videos, maps, ebooks, notes, lists, and whatever else, but the ability to replicate files and share them with others would definitely give anybody an edge in the apocalypse, both on FTP server, which would run neatly on any device, or a Soundbar server on Linux, or something like that would fill this role perfectly, and in addition there are plenty of apps that would allow someone to automatically sync files between devices, so those might be looked into as well. Continuing on, depending on your setup, if you wanted to host a website on this hypothetical network, then you probably want to look into web scripts. Web scripts allow you to create a complex network with no coding, and things such as WordPress blogs or discussion boards and stuff like that could be easily built up with no coding or anything like that. Ending my examples, you also may need specific software for any tools you're using. Say you want to create a GoTenna mesh network, well then obviously you'd probably need software from GoTenna mesh. Same goes for ham radio packets or phone jailbreaking software or equipment repair software and manuals or anything else specific to your setup. Beyond that, there's probably a million other examples I could give, but I'm lazy and these are what came to mind. Uptime. Once you have a network set up and software taken care of, the next question is how long will you keep it online? The simplest option would just be to try and leave it up 24/7, but that may not be the best solution. If you have the power, then certainly having the ability to communicate with others at all times would be ideal, but if you're budgeting power, there might not be enough for it to be worth it. It may be found that leaving it on for say 8 to 12 hours a day would allow everybody to use it when they need it, but also cuts back on power so that you know you won't run out. Or maybe have multiple different locations, each with their own local networks all bridged together through radio communications, so you leave some or all of the local networks online 24/7, but only run the radios to bridge the connections between the different locations, only for a few hours a day to cut back on power. But again, this is all a hypothetical thought experiment, so there's no real answer here. A phone might take a week worth of time to burn through the same amount of power as the server does in an hour, so you may have tons of power to burn, or you may be so limited that you can't even keep the phones on 24/7. So use cases. So with the basics sort of explained, I thought I'd touch on ways you could actually possibly use it. The first, and biggest by far, reason why networking like this would be useful in a hypothetical apocalypse would be that instant communication across long distances would be really useful. Most of this would probably be done in a texting form, making it silent if you wanted to alert people for strategic purposes without making noise, and its super small amount of data that it takes up would make it easily read and stored, so you're not limited solely to what someone's saying in real time. This can be broken into two parts. First, as the old saying goes, knowledge is power, and if you send a message to someone miles away about something time sensitive, then that can be extremely valuable. From getting help to somebody who's injured, to warning of an attack by people, zombies, or whatever other apocalyptic threat that would fit this thought experiment, in addition to real-time collaboration, would be really useful when responding to said issues. The second, a bit more mundane, is the administrative side of surviving. Being able to share files on most types of setups discussed would make it possible to share information on anything from people to resources to collected data, and in the fictional apocalypse that accompanies this thought experiment, it would probably be extremely useful to share things like spreadsheets on resources that are needed or in surplus, information on people and who's good or bad, weather, and any other form of data. But file sharing isn't just limited to spreadsheets. Ebooks, guides, videos, audiobooks, software, photos, and just about any other kind of file could be shared through a number of different setups like this, and these files could be huge in providing information for people. And as said before, knowledge is power. It can also just be used for entertainment, which would probably be a pretty big morale boost. Last, this network could preserve data. Everything from Game of Thrones to scientific research, to different extents, is an achievement, and while sticking copies of data on a thumb drive might be destroyed through bit rot within a few years to a decade, as long as this network remains up and running, it would be possible for data to be preserved a fair bit longer. Now, of course, if factories are going to stop producing electronics forever, then eventually the data would be lost anyway, but a network like this could probably be running for a good 20 to 30 years before the world's monocrystal solar panels start dying out. So, hold on to Game of Thrones for just a little bit longer. Okay, so finally here, now that I've done all this random explaining, hopefully I can draw a couple of visualized examples and it'll actually start to make sense. As you can see on the map, we have a big town, a hamlet near that big town, 3 small towns, an isolated building, and a small house. The purple circles represent network hardware specific to each location. The red circles represent the Wi-Fi/LAN network reach. The green lines represent a network using radio waves to communicate long distances between individual networks. And the blue line represents a proxy ham style device. And last, let's just assume that everyone's using the Briar app as a primary means of communication. Starting with the big town, let's say they got a whole bunch of people and a fair bit of power. Their local networking hardware includes a desktop PC, a router, a small server, and a radio that stays on 24/7. The radio is connected to the desktop PC, and the desktop PC and small server are connected to the router, which is pretty powerful. The PC has an FTP server on it, allowing anyone to upload or download files from it, and it also handles packets from the radio. The server has a DNS setup on it, and also allows people to host a couple of really simple websites. The router itself provides a Wi-Fi/LAN network that covers most of the town, and given the PC and small server are connected to it, anybody who logs into the Wi-Fi or LAN network can access all the content on those devices. For example, FTP file share. Not to mention that anyone connected to the Wi-Fi/LAN network are also capable of transmitting peer-to-peer data, so communication like Briar can be done. And thanks to the radio setup in the big town, anyone who is on the big town's LAN network can also connect to other LAN networks as long as they have a radio that can send and receive packets as well. So the hamlet is just outside the big town, and they have a pretty unique setup. They just have a proxy ham type device that's capable of connecting to the big town's LAN network from about, say half a mile away. This proxy ham-like setup then creates its own Wi-Fi network, but connecting to the proxy ham-like device in the hamlet is just as if you connected to the network in the big town, and despite the fact that the hamlet doesn't have a radio setup or any local devices providing them with content, since the hamlet's wireless network is just pretty much an extension of the big town's network, they can piggyback off the big town's hardware and use their servers and radio setups just as if they were close by. Town 1 is a fair bit smaller, and they have less in terms of hardware. They just have a radio, a laptop with an FTP server on it, which also handles radio packets, and a Wi-Fi router connected to the laptop that covers the center of the town at least with a LAN. People on the LAN can share files to the FTP server and communicate with others through Briar, and the radio antenna allows them to communicate with other town servers such as Big Town, and can also communicate with peer-to-peer data such as Briar with people who are on other LANs who also have a radio antenna. Though the connection is fairly slow over the radio, at least as compared to the LAN, it still works. But Town 1, however, lacks as much power, so they only leave the laptop, router, and radio on for 12 hours a day, and then they turn it off at night to preserve power unless they need it on for one reason or another. Town 2 also lacks a large amount of power, but they go about it in a bit of a different way. Their network consists of a radio, a cell phone, and a Raspberry Pi that is left on at all hours. The Raspberry Pi is connected to the radio, and that allows other systems to link up through the radio. The Raspberry Pi then connects to the LAN that is created by the cell phone, and the cell phone can also run tools such as an FTP server, though obviously with the cell phone, the trade-off for the low power requirements is limited space and computing capabilities. Nevertheless, devices can still be connected to the LAN created by the phone and operate on it just like any other LAN created on any other network. Town 3 is limited in their power and is the smallest of the towns, so all Town 3 has is just a laptop connected to the radio. The laptop could create a network, but instead it's just usually off, and the laptop and the radio are only turned on when any individual wants to use it, so they fire up the laptop and the radio and can communicate with other networks, but just use the laptop itself as a means of communication and otherwise keep everything off to limit power consumption and complexity of the local town's hardware. But next, the isolated building. Let's say the isolated building is an apartment building, and this building, thanks to its concrete walls and the hills between this and the other town, make it unfeasible to use a radio to communicate with the other towns. While a repeater might be able to be set up on a hilltop and /hoard the building or roof, it's not exactly within the means of the people there, so in this case they just have a local laptop that hosts a Samba file server, which operates similar to an FTP server. This laptop acting as a server is situated on one side of the building and is also creating a LAN network, and on the edge of the LAN network there is a Wi-Fi extender that provides a boost to the LAN's reach and covers a good part of the building. With file sharing on the laptop and messaging through Briar, a good amount of people in the building can communicate with each other, and additionally, whenever someone travels from a town with a radio to that specific isolated building, as long as they have the Briar app, they can connect and immediately update all the people in the building with any distributed messages throughout the rest of the network, as well as manually upload whatever they wish to the Samba server. Last, we can cover the random house. Let's say this random house is home to a family who farms plants and livestock as well as scavengers. The only hardware they have there is a phone, but whenever somebody drops by from another town, they can connect the phones through Bluetooth or a temporary LAN created by one of the phones, and have all messages coming and going from the larger networks exchanged. They can also exchange files and the like whenever they want, and this would allow them to organize things like trade that utilize the larger set of networks without actually having hardware set up at that random house, except for a simple phone. Farther, since they need very little power, they can probably suffice on a super tiny solar panel, or with just manual power generation options like a hand crank radio with USB output. Well, that's about it. I hope you found this interesting. It was really intended more of as a kind of, learning adjacent piece than anything resembling a tutorial. Stay safe, have a good one, and if you're interested in any of the concepts here, you can always actually give them a try in the real world.